Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my podcasts on GetHimItSpiz22.com. Today, I'm joined by somebody I've actually been on his show before, I do believe. And
That's
now
right.
I thought, well, you know what? Maybe it's time I got this dude on my show because he's an interesting young guy, not so young anymore, but a lot younger than I am. It's Mr. Dom Dalmasso. And Dom runs the Logos Project podcast,
hmm
which has done a lot of really good interviews. How long have you been doing that now, Dom?
Oh boy. I think it's been 2.5 years now. I'm not exactly
Yeah.
sure to be honest.
And I think I was on it last year or maybe even 2 years ago. I can't
hmm
even remember now. I've been on
Yep.
so many they kind of run together, but yours stood out. And I don't say that to be Garrett. Oh, I've been on so many podcasts. I can't keep track. But I have, I've been on a lot of them. They're a
Yeah.
dime a dozen these days. But the ones that are that stand out,
hmm
you remember. And what stands out about your podcast is, I think it's balance, it's intelligence, it's theological depth, and so I did want to get you on here. Now, the
Thank you.
immediate provocation for me reaching out to you, there was a Facebook post that you had maybe a couple weeks ago now, 2 3 weeks, that was, I thought, very profound and very interesting. We'll get to that in a second. But first, I want to let my viewers and readers know, well, who is this guy that runs the Logos Project? Why does Chapp have him on? We're going to be talking today about Joseph Ratzinger. I think in particular, I've been talking about him a lot lately. But
hmm
so, what is your? I mean, you were in the Marines, and you've got a degree from Holy Apostles Seminary up in
hmm
Connecticut. So, you've been in the SSPX, the Lefevre group. So,
Yeah.
okay, who is Dom Del Masso? Give us the rundown of how you got from A to Z, Dom.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the Society of St. Pius X, and it was precisely during the pontificate of Pope Benedict that my family transitioned to the Fraternity of St. Peter because of Summorum Pontificum, among other things. It was a gradual transition. And so, Pope Benedict has always been someone that's kind of loomed, in the background of my faith journey, you might say. But so many pieces kind of came together, which led me to take a deep dive into his theology. And I have been enjoying myself. It's quite incredible. And I've been trying to allow his theology to shape not just how I think, but how I act, which he would really be happy to hear that. But well, so after we joined the Fraternity of St. Peter, I joined the Monastery of Clear Creek in Oklahoma, which is a daughter house of the Monastery of Foncombe in France, which itself is a daughter house of the Monastery of Solesmes, which is part of the whole liturgical movement history with Don
Yeah.
Guéranger, and a lot of history there. And I learned so much. But it was at Clear Creek that I guess my faith took a turn because having growing up in traditionalist circles, and I'm trying not to be too harsh anymore. I used to be a lot more harsh with trads. I'm trying to be a little kinder, but anyway, the point being is that I received a kind of very propositional catechesis, Baltimore Catechism, somewhat dry, and scripture was, I only got it at mass in Latin, with the priest facing the wall. I know the stereotypes, I know what people will say about them, but the point being is that at Clear Creek, I encountered the Word of God in a completely new way. And a lot of this, of course, is my fault because, scripture was always available. So it's on me to appropriate it. But I encountered it in a way that was much more relational and dialogical, which fed into my discovery of Pope Benedict later on. So you have these things that started to merge together: Pope Benedict, Summorum Pontificum, SSPX, Fraternity, Clear Creek, discovering Scripture in a new way. And I left the monastery, didn't know what to do, joined the military, did 4 years, got out, and then started making friends with Protestants, and apologetics became a thing. And so I started to study theology at Holy Apostles, and then I discovered the writings of Joseph Ratzinger. Uh, Discovering him was actually kind of an interesting story if you're interested in hearing it.
I
I was
am.
in
Go ahead.
Yes, I was engaged with some agnostics and atheists on Christianity, apologetics when it comes to the resurrection. And so I kept hearing people mention this guy, N.T. Wright, this Anglican bishop, and he's a
Yeah.
really good New Testament historian. You should check him out. He's got some great stuff on the resurrection. So I bought his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, just fat volume.
Big,
And
huge book. I used it in
yeah,
classes, actually.
yes, and it's phenomenal. To this day I am indebted to N.T. Wright and love him. And he's just a wonderful theologian, mostly a historian. And so I just started reading through that, and it was excellent. But I had a dilemma when I finished it because N.T. Wright is very big on seeing the Greek component as something of a corruption to the Hebrew. And I could not square that with the church fathers. And so N.T. Wright's a Protestant. I think that's important. Again, I love
Yeah.
him to death. There's so much good in him. I'll recommend him still to this day. But there was definitely a dissonance there. And so I had no idea what to do and where to turn to make sense of this idea that the Greek is always a corruption of the original pristine Hebrew. And then I came across the first book I fully and attentively read by Joseph Ratzinger, which was his book Eschatology, Death and Eternal Life. And I do not recommend people start there when they read Ratzinger. It's
No,
probably his
you're right.
most complicated work of theology. But I'll tell you, that was a Damascus moment for me. I was knocked off my horse clean. He didn't need to persuade me. The way he laid out his thesis just convinced me instantly, which is that the Greek is not a corruption. It is if it stays separate from the Hebrew. This gets into a lot of details, but the point being is that I started to be a lot more sympathetic towards Plato. I was much more reactionary against Plato. I thought, the whole argument that in the councils there's a kind of Hellenization of Christianity that puts things into propositional truths, and philosophy moves away from the salvation history thing. Anyway, Ratzinger deals with all of that. The point being is this is where I discovered Ratzinger and where I reconciled my Catholicism with N.T. Wright's historical theology and moved away from Wright in that respect. And so, anyway, but the whole question of the Second Vatican Council was the next thing on the chopping board, right? Because Traditionis Custodes had come out, and a storm, broke out, and that's when my videos on the SSPX came out, and they caused a lot of controversy and a lot of attention. But long story short, I narrowed it down to the document Dignitatis Humanae. It really comes down to that document that the SSPX is unhappy with that, and traditionalists in general are still trying to figure out how does this make sense with the past? Is it continuous or not? And so it was precisely in the next book I read was Introduction to Christianity. And that was another paradigm change for me because in it, Joseph Ratzinger talks about, because he's very concerned with man today. What are his questions? What is he worried about? Why does he have a hard time believing? Something which, simply doing neo-scholastic theology doesn't necessarily answer. I mean, it could, I guess, but it didn't for me, right? And he says, well, today you have two paths, you might say. You have the materialist path, and then you have the idealist path. The materialist is that, the material world is all there is, and mind kind of emerges from it, like through at the end of a process of
Yeah.
evolution. And so reason comes after chaos in a certain sense. And Ratzinger says, well, if that's the case, then, reason, it undermines itself, right? And there's no rational argument for reason. And so that can't be the case. And the next path is idealism. And here he says, well, if everything is in the mind of God or in someone's mind, right, then nothing has its own autonomy, and therefore everything is God. And we're in a kind of pantheism that actually will denigrate humanism, a proper humanism, and the human being. So what's the answer? Well, he says Christianity, of course, right? It's his book, Introduction to Christianity.
Yeah.
And his answer, and this is really ironic because it ties into Dignitatis Humanae, he says, Christianity could be called a philosophy of freedom. And what he means by that is that there's a third option, and that freedom is that everything is the thought of God, but released into its own independence and therefore has its own freedom. And that's what accounts for the objectivity of matter. And so it's a third option, which turns out is the older option of the church fathers. But he develops it, and this ties into this is my journey understanding the council, right? He
This is
develops it.
beautiful. I'm loving this. Keep going.
No, he develops this, and I started to realize precisely with Dignitatis Humanae, the first thing the document says is that we do not contradict or condemned the past proposition that for freedom to be authentically free, it needs to be directed towards the truth. Okay, everyone's happy. The second premise is that we are not, however, saying that freedom determines truth. That's the liberal perspective.
Yeah, that's right.
So what's the third option? What is Dignitatis Humanae saying? Well, Dignitatis Humanae is saying that truth, in order to fully be truth, must come with freedom. And so, in a certain sense, it's not just a continuity because it's not the same teaching, and yet it's not a contradiction because it doesn't contradict the prior proposition. Neither is it liberalism because it's not saying that freedom determines truth. But the point being is that I started to see that the heart of the controversy on Second Vatican Council was not, in fact, the nature and grace debate going on with de Lubac, although that's part of it. The heart of the controversy was that initial draft, De Fontibus Revelationis and Dei Verbum. In the former, you had a propositional understanding of truth. In the latter, you had a relational and personal understanding of truth. Suddenly, it made sense to me that if you understand the world, through the Christian eyes as a philosophy of freedom, right, then the person becomes the category of truth itself. And that makes sense with the Trinity. If God is truth and the truth is a communion of persons, then relation is the prior category over and above substance, which is derived from relation. And so suddenly, this idea of freedom and truth made sense to me of Dignitatis Humanae and of what Dei Verbum was doing in breaking from that schema, which was seeing truth in a way that was too static and moving in a way that's truly a development without being a contradiction. So, in other words, there is a genuine change, is what I discovered in the Second Vatican Council, and it does go in a different direction. So, you might say it does change directions, but it's not in contradiction. It's just something new, but it's not something contradictory, is what I discovered. And that answered so many of my questions and continues to answer my questions as I approach the church's teaching. So just to add more about this, I mean, de Lubac comes up here with his book, Catholicism. Dignitatis Humanae, what it does is it kind of gives us a propedeutic for a global Catholicism, a Catholicism that's more Catholic, a more Catholic Catholicism. One way I like to put it is Benedict and his friends, like de Lubac and Balthasar, right? They're more integralist than the integralists because they give room to a freedom that can make a Catholic Catholicism possible. And to me, that's brilliant. And so, anyway,
Yes.
so I've been sold on that. That was my way out of the traditionalist way of seeing things, and without falling into the kind of liberal path either, but going with people like Ratzinger, and really making sense of things, and then sharing that online, and people have been helped by it. They tell me so.
Wow.
Yeah.
I hope all of my viewers and listeners for the past 5 minutes or whatever it was that took you to go through that was listening very carefully
Yeah.
because that story, even though I was never an SSPX, as a young man, I was very much a traditionalist.
Hmm.
We didn't call it that then. I read
Yeah.
things like there was no internet, so I read papers like The Wanderer,
Yeah.
which was kind of the remnant of its day, and
Yeah.
it was the Taylor Marshall of its day. And yeah, so I gradually came out of all of that
Hmm.
by reading Balthasar de Lubac, Ratzinger, and so forth, and coming to the exact same intellectual conclusions that your narrative just reached. So
Hmm.
even though some of the particulars are different, what you just described is kind of my intellectual pathway too. So
Yeah.
I thought I think that's really insightful. And I want to come back to something you said about sort of De Fontibus was more propositional
Hmm.
and De Verbum was more relational. I just did a thing on De Verbum with my friend Rodney Hauser a couple weeks ago,
Hmm.
maybe about 3 weeks ago. And we talked about how the Council Fathers rejected De Fontibus Revelationis.
Hmm.
Uh, Sacrosanctum Concilium was the first document put out by the council, but it was not the first document considered. The first one considered
Yeah.
was De Fontibus, and they rejected it. And Joseph Ratzinger had a hand in its rejection.
Yeah.
And so I like to point out this was a seminal moment in the history of the Second Vatican Council.
That's
when
the
the
nub,
council.
I think. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, no, I just wanted to say because a lot of people, speak. Well, I don't want to drop names, but a lot of people will, use the Lubac as a punching bag, which is just such a horrible thing. But anyway, but the point being, really, it's Ratzinger, and the fact that
Yeah,
people actually like him because of the liturgy, which I appreciate as well. But it's really him that's at the center of the change of direction. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? There's a lot of converging factors, but it's really Dei Verbum to me that is the hermeneutic, right, of
yeah.
continuity, of reform, of interpretation of the council. It makes sense if you understand that transition, but to the it's really a development of the Christological and Trinitarian trajectory of councils, which is this idea that person, that relation, is the ontology of Christianity. It's the new metaphysics of Christianity.
Oh
So yeah.
God, this is so good. That's right. You know, if we truly believe that ecumenical councils build from previous ones deepen, I mean, it's simply not true. For example, that the Council of Chalcedon merely repeats what the Council of Nicaea said, just in a
Mhm.
slightly different way. Now, there's something. I mean, you go from Nicaea through Constantinople, through Ephesus and Nestorius and Cyril of Alexandria, onto Chalcedon, and then even beyond. You see
Mhm.
that there is a real deepening of the church's understanding of things, and there's no rupture. It's in
Mhm.
continuity,
That's
but there
right.
were also slight corrections, of course, along the way, saying, okay,
Yeah.
maybe homoousios could lead us to an overly monistic understanding that Christ is God, but not really human. And so we have to nuance
Mhm.
that. And so, yeah. And so Vatican II, gosh, I think you've nailed it. It's the relational aspect of the person, beginning the Trinitarian
Mhm.
persons, then translated into understanding of human personhood. Relationality as a transcendental property of being that kind of defines yeah, all of
Yes,
that's
yes.
there.
And that's the lens through which we should read Gaudium et Spes, because it is a controversial document, as people who have studied the council know. But it's precisely through that Trinitarian and Christological, Trinitarian because Christological lens that Gaudium et Spes 22, right, is the heart
Yeah.
of that document, right? And that's how you interpret it. And it is a propedeutic to a new Christian humanism, right? Now, at the time, overly optimistic, granted, right? But definitely, definitely a propedeutic, I think, a programmatic, direction. John Paul II believed that, and that's very clear to me. But
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, no, you go ahead.
Well, there's something else that I've been thinking about Vatican II and Joseph Ratzinger. First of all, as a theologian, if we appropriate him more, a lot of the tension and fighting in the church, I think, wouldn't be completely resolved, but it would head in a direction that's constructive. If we put Ratzinger in dialogue with, I read a lot of Thomas and I read a lot of Ratzinger, and to them, together they fit well for me because they have different ways of writing, very different. Ratzinger's a musician, right? His theology is a symphony. uh you know uh what's his name, Aquinas, right? He's more of
Yeah.
the
Oh,
he's
what's
the he's
his
the
name?
yeah. Aquinas, he's like the mortar. He's like this, foundation. He's just massive, right? And so if you put those together, I think you have a constructive way of looking at the world and of engaging with people who disagree with you or who agree with you in a constructive way. But Vatican II, right? So the Old Testament, in a certain sense, was interpreted by
Oh,
Christ, or
excuse
Christ
me.
was that towards which the Old Testament pointed. But so Christ reveals the meaning of the Old Testament, but also Christ reveals the meaning of God the Father and therefore the Holy Spirit. And then the New Testament is almost like an exegesis of the exegesis of the Father, which is Jesus. But then, so that's why the early councils are all about Christology and Trinitarian theology. They're trying to understand how the old points to Christ, how Christ gives meaning to the old, and then how the new interprets the interpretation of God. But now we're asking questions about the interpreter, that is the church. And so Vatican II opens this era of a new phase in ecumenical councils, again, which is not it's not a repudiation of the past, precisely a deeper appropriation of the past, which now is asking the subjective question: who is the church? Who is the one interpreting the exegesis of the Father? The church is not a group of philosophers who come up with a philosophical system to understand who God is. The church is a relation of human persons, and that relationship is concrete in the Eucharist, in love. And so it seems to me that John Paul II said the hermeneutic of the Second Vatican Council can be summarized in a single word, and that word is communion, communio, right? And so
Yeah.
it seems to me that we're in the age of the theology of the church, and that's why Lumen Gentium is the next great document of the council. That's my interpretation of the trajectory of the church's reflection. It starts with Christ, to understand how he's pointed to by the Old Testament, and then the New Testament is the interpretation of Christ and therefore of the Trinity. And now we're turning kind of in towards ourselves, but the danger with that, of course, is kind of what we saw after the council, is this imminent frame, as Charles Taylor puts it. But
Yeah.
if we interpret the interpreter to better open ourselves up towards the interpreter of the Father, a new humanism, right? This is Gaudium et Spes, a new focus on the human person that is deeply Trinitarian and deeply Christological, is the way forward for a truly Catholic Catholicism, I think. But anyway, I'm on a
No,
tangent.
no, no, don't. This is why I had you on. I
Yeah.
think you are for a guy that is just recently, got his degrees and stuff from Holy Apostle.
Mhm.
You are really, I think, on top of your game. And I've listened to some of your shows. I've read some of your Facebook posts and stuff. And I just
Mhm.
every time I just say, this guy gets it. He
Yeah.
gets it, and it's and
Thanks.
rarely, the problem, and this, Dom, the reason why I get so excited when I read some of your stuff or watch your videos is because the problem with communio theology is that it doesn't fit well in any sort of reductive category. Oh, they're liberals, or they're
Mhm.
traditionalists, or they're neocons. It just doesn't fit into any of those categories.
Yeah.
And yet I consider it to be the most profound theology of, since Aquinas. I really do.
Mhm.
You look into the era of church history, and there are moments of great intellectual, exploding in the church. The
That's
patristic
right.
era is one, and then you get the great medievals: Bonaventure, Peter
Mhm.
Abelard, Aquinas. These guys, and then there are some other people in the Renaissance and Baroque eras, of Bellarmine, this kind of stuff. But really, beginning then in the 19th century and on into 20,
Yeah.
you see this massively creative explosion of new theologies that show up then. Some of them not great, but I
Mhm.
think the Ressourcement school that then becomes the Communio school, for all the
Yeah.
reasons that you just said, are
Mhm.
give us the pathway towards a truly, I like the way you put this, a Catholic Catholicism.
Yeah.
Okay. A
Homage to
Catholic.
de Lubac there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also,
Yeah.
I'm glad you defend De Lubac. I mean,
Mhm.
he has become the punching bag for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And my attitude is this with regard to De Lubac,
Mhm.
and Aquinas. We get bogged down in these endless debates about whether or not De Lubac got Aquinas right or not.
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't.
Yeah.
Uh, but at the very least, two things. Number one, I think Aquinas was ambiguous on the topic of nature and grace, because Aquinas was not trying to answer the same theological dynamic, the same questions that we're trying to answer now. He had a different
Mhm.
set of concerns. And so he sounds like a De Lubacian understanding of nature and grace at sometimes. At other times, he sounds positively,
Yeah.
dualistic. And so my attitude is, at this point, as great as Aquinas was, I'm willing to set Aquinas aside in the topic and ask the deeper question: was de
Yeah.
Lubac right about nature and grace? Maybe Aquinas,
Yeah.
whatever Aquinas's views are, maybe he
Yeah.
was wrong. Maybe he was wrong. The deeper question is, what is the proper relationship of nature and grace? And even there,
Yeah.
if de Lubac is a bit one-sided or something, if he gets some things wrong, he opened the debate. He opened the question. And therefore he's to be given great credit for that. Otherwise, we'd be still stuck in a form, a really horrible form of neo-scholastic two-tier
Yeah.
metaphysics. Anyway, no, I'm ranting and
No,
raving.
no, no,
Go
no.
ahead.
That's
Go
great.
ahead.
So when it comes to the nature and grace debate, I've just picked up Surnaturel by de Lubac, because everybody's talking about it and no one's read it because it's not translated. I mean, there's this
Right.
subsequent work where he adds nuances and stuff like that, but no one's really read it. So I've decided, I'm just going to go to the horse's mouth. So I just started the book, so I don't really know yet. But what I do know is that oftentimes when it comes to the life of the church, this is a red herring. Again, it's Dei Verbum and De Fontibus. That's where the nub is, I
Yes.
think. Now, that being said, there's something about de Lubac and his idea of the priority of unity, and you know, because there's that saying that you unify in order to properly, sorry, you distinguish in order to properly unify. De Lubac says no, you unify in order to properly distinguish. And there's something in his work so far, from what I've read, that is deeply profound, because a lot of the terms that we use that come from the tradition, I really believe modernity has transubstantiated them. And what I mean by that is that the appearance are all the same, right? But there's something that's been flipped in the very essence of the word. And for example, a good example to use is the word religion, right? It means something completely different today because of liberalism.
Yeah.
Liberalism changes the meaning of words while leaving the appearances. And de Lubac was deeply aware of this. And what he says is that, you know, let's go back to the unity they had in the beginning. And then by that unity, then make the distinctions that we need to make. But the problem is now we live in this divided, you know, intellectually divided, you know, faith, reason, nature, grace, philosophy, theology, the whole debate he had, you know, with Gilson and Maritain. But what people are doing today is they're trying to bring together something that they deem to be disparate in the beginning already. And so, but what that ends up being is addition Catholicism, right? And addition Catholicism is not true communion. The distinction of persons flows from the unity of love that is prior. Love always comes first. And de Lubac, that's what he's doing. So whether he got the details right, I don't know yet. But what I do know is, as a hermeneutic, that's spot on. We need to do that. We need to start with that unity and then distinguish. If we start with distinctions, we're already dividing things in a way that is not Catholic. And to
Yeah.
me, that's what the two Schindlers, both of them, saw this deeply. And you know, I'm a newbie. I'm still reading all the literature. You know, but when I read David Schindler Jr., I started with him. I see this throughout what he's saying, is that there's all of these dichotomies that we're granting the opposite side, and therefore kind of you know, we're fighting on their playing field. But why are we assuming that that's the playing field? So I don't know. That's been my take of it. So.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, de Lubac, and going back to the fathers,
Mhm.
uh, really did want to begin with the unity of things, and then distinguish after that. And that's also true of his concept of the church and of salvation.
Yeah.
He begins with the presumption of a kind of corporate notion of salvation,
Yes.
and then
Yes.
out of that corporate notion of salvation proceeds to make other kinds of finer distinctions. But once again, the priority goes to the
Yes.
primordial unity of
Yes.
all human beings in Christ.
Can I say
You say anything
that's
you want, sir.
that is so Catholicism, right? His seminal work, Catholicism, is the program of the entirety of the theology of Joseph Ratzinger. And Joseph Ratzinger's theology is symphonic precisely because of this hermeneutic of unity. The themes, you know, when you listen to Mozart, he uses a particular set of themes, and then they keep popping up in his music, and then they intertwine and interlock. But there's always that unity of theme, right? That's Ratzinger. Where did he get it from? De Lubac, right? Because of that priority of unity, right? And that is a Catholicism that can lead to communion, right? If we realize that communion precedes us, sin is division and follows from the priority of communion. And then redemption is the reunification, but through the priority of communion, not by some kind of subsequent communion that presupposes an initial division. I don't know if that makes sense,
Oh,
but
well, yeah, that
yeah,
we're all saved. It's just me and Jesusism, and we're all
yeah,
saved like
yeah.
little individual grains of sand.
Mhm.
And then God adds one piece of granular saved person on top of another. And then all of a sudden, out of that aggregate, we
Yeah,
get a pile of sand called the church. No, no,
yeah,
no,
that's
no,
right.
a
That's
million
right.
times no.
Yeah, I mean, it's very mathematical, right? It's very modern. It's extremely modern. It's for this you know, atomist view of physics, you know, of the world. And there's
Yeah.
so many of these presuppositions. Again, Schindler has been so good at pointing this
Well,
out.
and Big Dave Schindler, as we always
Hmm.
distributed Big Dave and Little Dave, but now
Yeah.
Big Dave is passed on. But David L. Schindler, the elder,
Hmm.
uh, his way of putting it was that we exist in liberalism, in the modern liberal order, within a
Hmm.
set of relationships which are conceived of extrinsically to one another.
Yes.
Schindler's big boogeyman,
Brilliant.
and it's brilliant, was the
Yeah.
extrinsicism of everything. And so you've nailed it, Dom, when you talk about the atomization of it. That's why Schindler loved, for example, the physicist David Bohm, Boaehm,
Mm,
because David Bohm was a physicist. I don't know what his theological views were, but he believed in what he called
hmm
the explicate and the implicate order, namely
mm,
that the world of things that we see, a phenomena, is
hmm
is ultimately grounded and united together in what he
Yeah.
called the implicate order, a kind of subatomic order that was
That's
almost a
brilliant.
metaphysical
Yes.
concept for David Bohm. And so this was huge for Schindler, who also then believed in that because he was a Balthasarian, a Ratzingerian, believed in
Yeah.
that ultimately relationality is the ultimate category for
Yeah.
interpreting all these things.
I think that that's brilliant. I mean, I think that's the way forward in theology. But that brings me back to Aquinas and Thomism. I think at the end of his book, Principles of Catholic Theology, Ratzinger admits that there was a little bit of a overly drastic, kind of waving away of the Thomism that they had received, right? And I think that if we look at the aftermath, at the kind of there's a question in the Summa. I think it's in the Prima Secundae, question 96, one of the articles in question 96, where Thomas says, is it a good thing to change custom, to change law? And he says that sometimes there are good reasons to make a change, but if it should be done rarely because the bad effects of changing law are that it diminishes the authority of law. So to me, this is a way of interpreting the post-conciliar chaos. There was some serious recalibrations in the council, but what that did is it diminished the authority of the church's teaching in a way where people just said, "Well, I'll do whatever I want now, right?" Because the church is
Yeah.
changing her
Yeah.
mind. So, Thomas, I think, has a lot of wisdom there, and I think
Can
Ratzinger,
I interrupt for 1 second? And
yeah,
it's
yeah,
also because if the faith of the average Catholic in the preconciliar church was essentially legalistic and forensic, when
yeah,
the church said, like I like to say, when the church lifted the lid off of the ecclesiastical libido by simply saying, "Well, these laws are all changed now,"
yeah.
exactly what you just said happens. All right, so go
I
ahead. I'm sorry, I
No, no,
interrupted you.
I agree. I agree. But the question is, because Ratzinger then, defending himself, of course, Ratzinger is deeply consistent. That's another charge against him, which I could get into. But defending himself, nonetheless, he admits a kind of naive waving of the hand of Thomism. So moving forward, what do we do? I think that a Thomism that takes seriously this priority of unity, that reads Thomas in his historical context, not just as this kind of Cartesian propositions that we can just bring to the presence. We have to, make them living, make them our own. Gilson was really good with that. Going back to the historical Thomas, it seems to me that Thomism moving forward is essential, but it has to take these critiques seriously. And on our side, and I don't like saying our side, there's no sides. We're all on the same side. There's distinctions, but maybe to take to heart the overly naive dismissal that happens basically. So I think that's a fruitful way to move forward. On the one hand, to incorporate Thomism, to not be so judgmental any longer. I am very judgmental of the
Yeah.
preconciliar Thomism, but to kind of slow down and to kind of that post I made, right? To stop blaming people in the past and to share the blame. I believe that I need to work on that myself. And so, how can we constructively move forward? Well, on our side, to welcome scholastic theology, and on the side of scholastic theology, to take seriously both the concerns of the man of today and the original unity from which the scholastics were working. And that is kind of what Rocher Small was trying to do. I think that's the way forward. And so if we can feed off of each other, I think. So
Oh, it's true, especially when you look at what it was Aquinas was doing in his own age. Aquinas was a controversial figure in his age.
yeah.
I mean, when he went to go teach at the University of Paris, I mean, there was darn near violence breaking out.
His
Uh,
theology was condemned by the Bishop of Paris after he died. Yeah.
that's right, because of the introduction of Aristotle.
Yeah.
And, in the eyes of the people of that time, and the church fathers were more Platonic than Aristotelian for sure. They knew more
hmm
about Plato than Aristotle for starters. But
Yeah.
Plato, of course, when you read Plato and you read Aristotle,
hmm
Plato does come across, well, he's the religious one, he's the
Yeah.
spiritual one, he's the one always
Yeah.
talking about the soul and stuff like that. So he just seemed like, oh, well, that's the philosopher that we're going to use here.
Yeah.
Aristotle it appears at first glance to be more secular, to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
less concerned with divine things. And so
Hmm.
Aquinas was accused of introducing this dangerously secular notion that could lead to atheism into the body politic of the church. But Aquinas stuck to his guns, and he was a genius,
Yeah.
and he was also more Platonic than people give him credit for.
That's very
But
true.
still,
Yeah. Yeah.
so the point being, right, that I think you're absolutely correct that in order to be a good Thomist, we not only need to follow certain Thomistic principles, we need to propositions, but we need to follow the Thomistic pedagogy and methodology, which was, hey, let's take a look at the spoils of Egypt here.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at
Yeah.
what's out there and how can we creatively apply it to the world of right now. So
I,
anyway, so you
yeah.
mentioned blah blah blah. I just got an email that was important that I got
You're
distracted
good.
for a second. I'm
You're
looking
good.
down at this going, oh geez, it's from
Well,
my
can I
friend
just say real
Matt
quick
Lever. Go
about
ahead.
you said about Aquinas being more Platonic than people think. I read this book for undergrads. It's pretty dense, but it's for undergrads. It's called The One and the Many by Norris Clark.
Norris
Uh,
Clark.
yes, and it opened up Aquinas in a way that was just incredible for me, like it very formative. And Norris Clark points out that the structure of Thomas's theology is Neoplatonist. He introduces the framework of act and potency of Aristotle, but within a Neoplatonist framework. And Richard Decloux put it well. He said that Aquinas and Bonaventure are Neoplatonizing Aristotelians. Even Bonaventure, who was much more skeptical of Aristotle. And I think that what this points to is a kind of dialectic between Aristotle and Plato. Between philosophy and theology, really, we have to be careful not to collapse theology into philosophy or religion into politics, the church into the state, but also not to divorce them either. Again, it's that middle path, which is why I like de Lubac so
Yeah,
much, right?
yeah.
It's that paradoxical fine line. And I think that we have to keep that in mind when something becomes overly one-sided, which is the criticism about before the council. And I don't want to ruffle any feathers, but then I think it's just not healthy, even if they're correct on details. It's just not healthy because the truth is much greater than us. We don't come up with it. We are encountered by it, and then we think it through. Aquinas would be spinning in his grave if what I said there was something that people denied. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no. People have pointed out that the entire schema of the Summa, for example, follows the Platonic schema of exitus reditus,
Yes.
meaning
Yeah.
that, creation can be explained to be is that which sort of goes out from God, exits from God.
Yeah.
But then in this Neoplatonic scheme gets sort of reabsorbed into God in a kind of monism, a reditus, a return. But
Yes.
then Aquinas and other Christian, the Christian father and Aquinas, they adopt that exitus reditus scheme, but then they Christianize it, right? The
Yeah.
reditus is through Christ and isn't just a reabsorption into God, like a raindrop going
Yes.
into the ocean, right?
No, but this goes back to Ratzinger and his introduction to Christianity. The problem originally with the Neoplatonist schema wasn't the schema, but it was some of the presuppositions, which is
Right.
emanation is not something free that comes from God. It's almost like a necessity. And here Ratzinger will say, no, it's precisely freedom that makes creation to have its own independence in a way where a relationship can be established, a relationship of love between creator and creature. And so again, Ratzinger, I think, shows here he's synthesizing that whole trajectory
That's
in
right.
a way that's
Exitus and
palpable.
creation are slightly different concepts.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so Ratzinger, but the genius about Ratzinger is that he knows who he's talking to. He's talking to me and you. He's talking to us, modern people. And he knows what things prevent us from believing. And he wants to get around that. And that's why I love him. Anyway.
No, I agree. And I read Introduction to Christianity, I believe, when I was like a sophomore, junior undergraduate, maybe at age 20 or so. And I just,
Mhm.
at that age, it was like trying to get a sip of water out of a raging fire hose,
Yes.
squirting it. But still, I had the instincts to know there is something really profound here. And so it was a book I just kept coming back to.
Hmm.
over and over and over again.
Yeah.
But even I think Ratzinger would admit the book has some flaws in it. And if
Hmm.
he were to if he had gotten a chance to rewrite it,
Yeah.
there might have been some changes, but still, it's this brilliant book. So anyway,
Hmm.
let's get on to. I want to get onto that Facebook post, and you
Yeah.
just mentioned it. So you had to do with let's not go back and revisit the past and just heap blame on people. So
Yeah.
unpack that Facebook post for us, because I was reading that and I thought, wow, this is good
Yeah.
stuff. Go ahead.
Well, what I was trying to get at is that there's a lot of chaos in the church. And you could say, speaking more poetically and not precisely, that there was a kind of mass apostasy after the council, a kind of turning in on oneself. Ratzinger calls it a kind of worship of the golden calf. And this repudiation of our heritage, which makes a lot of people angry, and it made me angry, and sometimes still does. But I think that it's just not productive, or for first of all, for your own salvation, right? To be angry at others for the mess that you find yourself in. And so this applies, I think, for the kind of, what people say, the boomer generation, the 60s, I don't know, whatever they call it nowadays. But the basically all the people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the silly season, right? They are mad. The younger generation is angry at these people. And some of the people who were able to rise above that during that time period, I think, are people like you, like communio theologians. I think communio theologians also have a little bit of resentment towards the neo-Thomists, and again, I understand that perfectly well as well. And then the some of the younger generation are angry at communio people for being angry at the neo-Thomists, and they want Thomas back. So everyone's angry, right? And what's the solution? I think it's the Our Father, right? The Our Father is a realization that I'm guilty. This is what Paul says in Romans in chapter 2 and 3, right? Everyone is guilty, right? Like,
Yeah.
you've been acquitted. So why heap blame on others when you are the one that is blameworthy and that has been acquitted? And then furthermore, if you read I think one of the problems with the way Romans has been read, especially since the Protestant Reformation, it's kind of because of Augustine, really, is that it's been read in a very individualist way. Romans 7 is about the internal struggle of Paul, but it's not. Paul is talking about Israel as a whole. This goes back to de Lubac. He's talking about corporate Israel, the corporate personality, Adam, right? The corporate man.
Yeah.
And so when one is guilty, when someone else is guilty, I share in that guilt, especially if it's your father's, right? Because you're their sons. And if you hate your fathers, you're going to hate yourself because your identity comes from your father. This is the son says, Jesus, right? I have nothing other than what belongs to my father. His own existence, his own individuality comes from the father, which is why he's able to be one God with the Father. The point being is that Jesus is the example here of one who takes the blame of others as the Son of Man and doesn't heap blame on them, but takes it upon himself and forgives. And so when we become like Christ, we forgive others because we've been forgiven. And that resentment can be transformed into a long suffering, a bearing of the guilt of others. And this reminds me, I just read Margaret Turek's book, Atonement, and it floored me. It was a phenomenal book. It answered all of my questions about the atonement in a beautiful, succinct way. It was just incredible. And it seems to me the way forward, holiness in the church today, with all of this resentment that we all share in some way or another, in the middle of this chaos of eating each other apart, is to stop, breathe, pray, repent, realize that God has forgiven me, and then to take on the guilt of others and to move forward in suffering for others out of love. It's to be Eucharistic. That, to me, that's the only way forward. And I've been even online. I've been, I've bashed on the SSBX, and I stand by what I said, like my arguments against them. But I just don't think for me that's a way forward. I need to stop looking for who to blame and just start becoming a living Eucharist, as Ratzinger would say. And I think that's the only way to just have peace in your own soul. And I know that the more I think that way, the more I calm down and the more I'm able to open myself up. The person opens themselves and becomes cosmic, right? And to love others and thereby to love myself, because when you hate others, you end up like really disliking yourself, especially if it's, your fathers or the generation before you. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at in the post, is that we need to stop, and the internet fuels this. We need to stop blaming and being angry. And that's not to say that there isn't blame. It's just to say that we share in it by being part of the same body. And so let's face up in ourselves, in our persons, to that guilt, and bear it in a way that atones, that transforms it for others. Like, that's the only way forward, it seems to me. Anyway, that was the gist of it.
And I thought it was brilliant. I remember sitting there being floored as I was reading it because first off, I agree with you. Margaret Turek's book, and I recommend it to all. I've interviewed her on this show with Rodney
I saw
Hauser.
that. Yeah.
But anybody that wants to get a grasp on the nettlesome issues that surround the theology of the atonement, you can do no better really than Margaret Turek. She teaches at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California, which is near San Francisco.
Hmm.
And her book on the atonement is simply called The Atonement. Is really good. What's good about it is that it's not very long. It's
Hmm.
long enough, but it's not very long, and it's
Yeah.
eminently readable to somebody who's got a basic grasp of theological ideas. And
Hmm.
so I really would highly recommend it to people. I would also recommend, if you're more theologically advanced, you read Ratzinger's Eschatology. You could
Yes.
also read Hans von Balthasar, Volume 4 of the Theodrama, which is Balthasar's soteriology, where he deals with the atonement. And Balthasar says there's like 5 models of the
Yeah.
atonement, and they're neither one is reducible to the other, but we have to maintain all 5 in a kind of tension with one another. And I'm also reminded of C.S. Lewis saying in his book Mere Christianity, where he has his theory of atonement as Christ is the perfect penitent. Even Lewis says ultimately the New Testament doesn't give us a completely perspicacious, thorough, synthetic
Yeah.
theology of the atonement. It just says, well, Christ's death, atones somehow for us.
Hmm.
Now it's a profound mystery that we have to think about. Anyway, I'm talking too much here, but what really struck me in this, I want to get more of your thoughts on this in your
Hmm.
post. Wasn't it was also, the corporate nature of our guilt. And so
Hmm.
once again, we're back to that Lubacian sense of you begin with the unity of things and then work out and make
Yes.
make distinctions
Hmm.
and so on. But what really struck me was that notion, if we're going to imitate Christ and follow in his footpath, we need to take seriously Christ's admonition that we take up
Yeah.
our cross and follow him. And by that, I don't think he simply meant, hey, you know what? Some bad things are going to happen to you too. So,
Yeah.
cinch up your belt and get ready.
Hmm.
I think that he meant was, if you're going to imitate me, you need to imitate the full pattern of my life.
Yeah.
And that means imitating the pattern and inner reality of my death. So we
Yeah.
have to enter into, like you put, we have to become Eucharistic. We have to enter into the Paschal mystery. Well, what is the Paschal mystery? What is that? It's the mystery of vicarious suffering that atones for sin. What
Hmm.
in the heck does that mean? St. Paul says, Christ became sin for our
Yeah.
sakes. We need to make up what is lacking in the sacrifices of Christ. Well, what's lacking in the sacrifice? Well, what's
Yeah.
lacking is me, you, us.
Yes.
Okay, in the sense that
Yes.
we have to now glom onto that somehow and
Hmm.
enter into it. So what is severely lacking, and once again, it's the individualism of today, and I'm going to get your comment on this now and I'll shut up. But what
No,
is
no, go
severely
ahead.
lacking today in our hyper individualistic, very Protestantized sense of salvation
Yes.
is this notion that for the Christian, to whom much is given, much is expected. We are not just saved by hoarding Christ to ourselves. We are saved precisely, as you said, through the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We are saved by entering into that vicarious pattern of suffering for the evils of others. And
Hmm.
this, I think, is a dimension of the atonement that has been undersold in the tradition and is now
Yes.
being retrieved. It's one of those things that we see in modern communio theology that to me strikes me as something really, really profound and a deepening of our understanding of salvation. Anyway, you go. I'm done talking. Now you go ahead.
I couldn't agree more. That's brilliantly put, and that's exactly right. And I think it's a lot of credit goes to Saint Therese of Lisieux here.
Yes.
Yes, and as Margaret Turek points out in her book as well, and Ratzinger in Introduction to Christianity, although that's more to do with atheism. But the point being is that what we see in Therese, this young, innocent 24, she dies when she's 24, if I remember correctly, is she wants to become love, the heartbeat of the church. She wants to become the Eucharist in a certain sense, right? And she wants to bear the atheism of others, right? And especially today, I mean, let's look around us, right? Today, it's a world, as Ratzinger puts it, the eclipse of God is all around us. So bearing that absence is the way where we can make God's presence in a paradoxical way present. And that goes back to Turek's book, which is phenomenal. And it talks about the presence of God in his absence, right? And so I think especially today that's the way to move forward. And I had something else to say, but it slipped my mind. But I really thoroughly agree with what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, there really was a time period in the church, especially in spiritual theology, where it became overly individualistic. And
Yeah.
I think this is something de Lubac raved against, and Ratzinger would agree with him in this. And so I think it's also I think partly, I don't want to oversell this, but it's partly what contributed to the political philosophy of Marxism, which is an alternative to communion, but just without God, because religion wasn't giving communion in a corporate
Yeah.
sense, in a societal and cultural sense. And I think de Lubac starts the ball rolling in a powerful way. But Ratzinger's theology is a very powerful response to Marxism, the most thorough I've ever come across. And again, I haven't read that much, but from reading Ratzinger, he has a chip on his shoulder about Marx. Because he sees Marx as extremely dangerous, precisely because of his astuteness, Marx's astuteness in pointing out a lot of the individualism and the sufferings it causes. Anyway, so the point being is that vicarious atonement, understood in that corporate sense, is the only path forward towards an integral humanism that will be an alternative to the atheistic humanisms that we've seen devastate our culture. And so I'm kind of rambling now, but I'm thoroughly agreeing
No.
with you. I think you put it
Yeah.
beautifully. Yeah.
And then the importance of De Lubac's book. Read Ratzinger, obviously, Introduction to Christianity, but read De Lubac, The Drama of Atheist Humanism, because I think that book influenced an entire generation of young scholars leading up to the council to make them
Yes.
realize that the answer is not to reject humanism, but to Christianize it from within and to out humanist the humanists, to
Yes.
show that our vision of what it means to be a human being is actually the far more profound vision. I'd also like to say, I'm glad you brought up Karl Marx, because a lot of Americans, I think, especially younger Americans,
Hmm.
born after the fall of the Soviet Union and so on, but even before then,
Yeah.
uh, they fail to understand the pervasive influence of Marxist intellectual thought in
Hmm.
Europe, in particular,
Yeah.
in the 20th century. We don't completely grasp or understand how in European intellectual circles, your choices were either some version of nihilistic Nietzschean existentialism
Yeah.
or Marxist intellectual analysis of history, the dialectic of history, or
Hmm.
Catholicism. Those were your three intellectual options, and that's
Hmm.
why, yeah, Ratzinger did have a chip on his shoulder with regard to Marx. So did De Lubac and
Yes.
Balthasar and that whole thing. And I'm reminded too of the late great Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce. I don't know how familiar you are with Del Noce, but
I've heard
uh,
of him, but I haven't read him
please
yet. Yeah.
read more Del Noce. I think you'd like
Yeah.
him, Dom. Del Noce is constantly grappling with, he died in the 80s or 90s, I think, but he's constantly grappling with
Hmm.
the ongoing influence of Marxist intellectual thinking in European life. And when we really need to, I think keep that ever before us as
Yes.
we read people like Ratzinger. Go ahead.
No, that going back to the post I put on Facebook, I brought up Dostoevsky because De Lubac also brings him up, and the reason why, I mean, if I finished the Brothers Karamazov a couple months ago. It took me a while to read, but I finished it finally.
Yeah.
And Dostoevsky, in the beginning of the book, it's a brilliant book. Everyone pick a year to read it and just spend time with it. It's just an incredible book. But Dostoevsky is a true Christian humanist. and de Lubac seized on that very well. And Dostoevsky says you're either an atheist socialist or you're an Orthodox Christian, because he's Russian, right? But the same applies to us, right? Either you are some kind of Marxist, a social justice warrior, or maybe like a kind of secular capitalist individualist, or you're a Catholic, right? If you're Protestant, you're the capitalist individualist. But the point being is that
Yeah.
you have two options on the table: a Catholic humanism, right? A truly universal Christian humanism, and then the atheistic humanism of Marx, Nietzsche, and the kind of existentialism of Sartre, right? And Ratzinger spends a lot of time on Sartre, which I find really helpful, because when I read Sartre, I feel like he's, what he's saying, I can relate to. That whole kind of the other is hell, that kind of finding your own freedom and your own meaning. Even though we know we shouldn't do that as Catholics, that meaning comes from God, we still live that way in this pagan world. And so Sartre he's a window into our own souls in a certain sense, our own guilt as modern people. And I think Ratzinger does a beautiful job at showing that only the dependence of love is the true freedom of man. And that these guys have
Yeah.
answers to our contemporary questions, problems, and sufferings. That's why I like them so much.
That the Ratzinger's insight, and I love what you just said, Dom, is that the essence of modernity, and you see it in Sartre, and you see it even to a certain extent in Nietzsche, is that existence precedes essence.
Hmm.
All right. And what they're rebelling against is this hyper essentialized notion of everything that then does become
Yeah.
kind of oppressive. And so they assert that existence is before all of these determining definitional taxonomic classifications into which we have to fit.
Yeah.
All right. And so I need to assert myself. And they thus begin to conceive of God's transcendence, as Bishop Barron would say, as a competitive transcendence. And,
Hmm.
and so the limits that God places upon us are truly limiting. And if
Yes.
I want to be unlimited, I have to throw off those limits. But Ratzinger, you correctly point out, in a relational, personal way of approaching,
Yes.
with love having the priority, the limits God places upon us delimit us. they free us. They liberate us. They're kind of they're limits that open up the realm of non-limit, and that's the paradox. That's the
Can, can,
irony that De Lubac and all of them are pointing at. Go
yes.
ahead.
Can I just say, this is exactly Ratzinger's point about the chaos after the council, the hemorrhaging, the nonsense, right? It was a moment of liberation from Christianity. We've forgotten that Christianity is what liberates us from the oppressions of the world.
Oh,
And
by
yet
the way, I'm going to
here,
interrupt you because that essay
yeah,
you turned me on to in his book on politics.
yes,
Oh gosh, that yeah,
faith
where
and
he said
politics. Yeah,
where he
chapter,
says that yeah, what's it? Faith
I,
and politics. What's the chapter?
it's chapter 2, salvation more than a
No,
cliche. I have it over
yeah.
here. Yeah,
And he says in there, and I read that and I thought, yeah, Dom's right. This is a great chapter because he says,
yeah.
we've gone from not only do we disbelieve in the salvation Christianity brings, we now want to be saved from
From
Christianity.
Christianity, exactly. And you're gonna tell me that the council was to blame if people have an understanding that they need to be freed from Christianity? No, clearly something was wrong. People wanted to be liberated from something that was wrong, right? And the council is the answer to a liberation that doesn't go wild, but to a truly Christian liberation. And it's communion, it's relation, it's the person of Jesus Christ, it's Christocentric, it's all there. And anyway, seeing that has been
Yeah.
just so comforting for me, and helped. It feeds my prayer. It feeds I'm trying to make it feed my actions when I relate with people, even though that's a
Well,
struggle. But
yeah,
yeah.
that's true. I mean, like you said in the post, and what you're trying to do ultimately is to build something more corporate and to understand why we don't necessarily want to have just a knee-jerk blaming of the people that created this apostasy, because they were,
Yes.
as you said in the post, they were fleeing a form of Christianity that they found oppressive.
Yes.
Rightly or wrongly, they found it oppressive. They
Yes.
felt as if what the church was doing at the Second Vatican Council was saving us from the church.
That's right. That's
you know,
right. Exactly. Yes.
and so now we're free to be Catholics that are churchless in a sense, or we get to make up church as we see fit, and the
Yes.
church is now greening. Now some on you on that post criticize you for that, saying, hey, I was alive in that era, and that's not true. Well, I'm telling you, I'm
Yeah.
65 years old, and I wasn't alive in
Yeah.
the preconciliar church, but
Yeah.
I obviously grew up in the immediate shadow of
Hmm.
that. My parents grew up in the preconciliar church, and certainly all of my aunts and uncles and grandparents and so forth, and there wasn't a one of them that didn't fully embrace the changes that came after the council, and in crazy ways, because they didn't
Yeah.
find the preconciliar church all that fulfilling.
Can I add
And
something
that's,
to
by
that?
the way, I'm not saying that
Yeah.
once again to blame. I'm just saying that
Yeah.
this was their perception, and we have to understand it. So go
Yes.
ahead.
No, I just want to. I'm not going to blame anyone. Facebook, the way it works is just it's very impersonal. But to defend myself, in a certain sense, having grown up in the SSPX and in groups that have tried to kind of continue the course as if the council did not happen, it's funny when I read Ratzinger and Delubach, why do I relate so much to their criticisms? So, in a certain sense, I know this is limited. In a certain sense, I did experience the preconciliar church, at least a Catholicism that
Yes.
ignored the council. So, I do relate to those criticisms. Why? I think because there's something there. So, anyway.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I was shocked beyond shocked when my blog, which started in 2020, went viral. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying that to brag. I mean, it did. And I was the
Yeah.
most surprised. I thought my students say, hey, chap, start a blog, my former students. I said, oh, I
Hmm.
hate blogs. I don't even want to read my own. But I thought, okay, I'll just toss out a few things. But anyway,
Yeah.
the first things I wrote about was a critique of traditionalism. I
Yeah.
critiqued Taylor Marshall. I critiqued Vigano. I critiqued not he's not a traditionalist, but uber angry kind of Catholicism. I
Yeah.
critiqued Mike Forrest
Yeah. Yeah.
and so on. And all of a sudden, out of the woodwork, all of these people that were either SSPXers or whatever were writing to me saying, yes, yes, yes,
Hmm.
yes. And so there is something there, Dom. I think you're right. Now,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
question would be, of course, and then you can address this,
Hmm.
is your experience and those of others in the SSPX and this hyper traditionalist movement,
Yeah.
is it really analogous to the form of Catholicism that existed before the council, or is it something different, somewhat similar, but also very
Yes.
different in the sense now it's an angry, reactive
Yes. Yes.
form of preconciliar Catholicism?
Yes, I mean this kind of ties into the Lubach's point, which is, philosophy after Christ can't be neutral towards theology because Christ happened. So in a certain sense, there's no neutral ground, right? Schindler and de Lubac would say this. Neutrality is kind of it's a myth, right? So the traditionalist movement after the council, although there's definitely similarities that are structural, right? It's not the same thing precisely because the council happened. Therefore, it presupposes there's no neutrality in the. So I don't want to be controversial. I have been too hard on the trads, and I'm reeling it back. I do think they have good points. I'm trying to be more irenic because I don't want to overreact. So I want to make that caveat. That being said, if you live a life that brackets the Second Vatican Council and say I don't reject the council, that's a false neutrality. The council happened. What will you do with it? Right? There's no
Yes.
neutrality here. Now, interpretation is where the game happens, right? Interpretation of the council. So it's not the same because the council happened. And yet, structurally, and what is taught and what is read, it is the same. So it's basically exactly what you said. But there's no neutrality, which is why there is these tensions, and which is why the mass can be weaponized, the older form, which I love. It can be weaponized precisely because of this fact that there isn't a neutrality. But again, I do want to add that I'm trying to be irenic because they do make points that I don't take lightly. And so I'm someone who is willing to engage in conversation. I am not here to, attack you because I used to be a lot more fiery in the beginning, and I'm not changing my mind. I still believe, but I like to think I'm consistent, right? But I do want to approach things with more charity. Anyway, does that make
Well,
sense?
yeah, and I suppose I could be accused of the same thing. I know a lot of traditionalists don't like me very much because they think I'm anti-trad. I'm not
Yeah.
anti-trad. In fact, I spend more time going after that highly secularized
Yeah.
wing of Catholicism. I actually loathe it
Hmm.
because that's what I grew up with. And to me, I mean, and they're in charge of things still to this day. I mean,
Hmm.
that branch of Catholicism. So, a lot of traditionalists love to point out, we trads don't have any power in the church, and here you are punching down at us when you really
Yeah.
ought to be
Yeah.
punching up at, well, I'd rather not be
Yeah.
punching at anyone, and that's your point.
Yeah.
And my point isn't to punch. My point is really, I'm desperate. I think you're the same way. I'm just desperate to get people to see that there
Yes.
is a theological pathway that
Yes.
is there at our fingertips to help us negotiate these dangerous waters, to help us make sense of Vatican II, which, as you said, it happened, deal with it, and to
Yes.
move forward. And that is the theology of the Communio Ressourcement School, the theology of John Paul II and Benedict and these guys. And yet it just seems to be ignored in the
Yeah.
church these days.
I do want to say, like you said, I don't want to punch anyone, but I will say, as a historical phenomenon that has its own way of thinking, I completely disagree with traditionalism. And I think the council is the correct answer. So, ideologically, you might say that's where I stand because it's provided me with a hermeneutic that makes sense of so much more than the narrow hermeneutic of traditionalism. And so, I just, no, I do not, I reject that way of viewing the world.
Oh,
So,
that's right. And that's why they're critical of the verbosity of Vatican II, the verbosity of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And they love the new credo of Bishop Schneider, which it's yes, no,
Uh,
yes, no,
yeah,
yes, no,
yes.
binary sort of answers to things. And
Mhm,
and the fact is as I said in an interview on Timothy Flanders' show, which is very good, The Meaning of Catholic, and he's a
mhm.
traditionalist. But so I don't hate traditionalists, but it was the
Yeah,
show
yeah.
was about Athanasius Schneider's book Credo, and it was an interesting
Mhm,
conversation. And I don't hate Credo. I'm just saying here's the deal. Here's why I don't think it's the answer, and here's why Vatican II and the Catechism of the Catholic Church are more verbose than they are. It's because
mhm,
there there are two forms of Catholicism that were leading up to the council. One is this dialectical form of Catholicism, as I like to say, and it was a Catholicism contra mundum. It
yeah,
was it was a series of yeses and nos. We're going to
mhm,
expose error. We're going to preach truth, and that's that. And it was mainly a series of rejections, rejections, rejections. So it's very dialectical.
yeah,
But the resource mod school of thought was more analogical. They wanted to find points of contact between Catholicism and the world, that overlapping area where there's the spoils of Egypt that we can appropriate and we can, in a sense, enter into conversation with the modern world in these elements. And that's going to require a more discursive description of the faith, more theological description of not a series of yeses
mhm,
and nos, but a more broadly narrative description of salvation history and theology. Everything that you did in like the first 10 minutes of this interview, laying all of that out. So I agree with you, Dom. Not only do I think that Second Vatican Council isn't a bad thing that we need to, I think it's great. I think does it have deficiencies? Oh yeah, you can
yeah,
take the
sure.
second half of Gaudium et Spes and throw it out the window as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
All right, because it reads like a globalist NGO, of the UN wrote it. Okay, yeah, it has
Yeah.
problems, but
Mhm,
overall, Dei Verbum, Lumen Gentium, certain elements of Dignitatis Humanae. I mean, I think this is clearly the
mhm.
theological path forward. Anyway, end of my rant. Go
No,
ahead.
I completely agree. I mean, so the thing about the council, this reminds me of de Lubac. He brings this up in Catholicism about doing theology on the terms of the heretics, right? That will make it so that you are reacting and negating and not presenting in a positive way the wholeness of the faith. Whole in Greek means Catholic, the
Yeah,
Catholicos, right? And so Vatican II is precisely a Catholic council. Now, they all are because they're ecumenical, which is another way of saying Catholic. But this one was the most ecumenical precisely because the most bishops were there, but also because we're at the dawn of a new form of globalization, right? Now, I'm not advocating for some kind of weird like one world order Freemason thing, right?
yeah,
But the fact of globalization is ahead of us, right? Because of technology, because of the economic system, the market, all that kind of stuff. Pope Benedict talks about this in Caritas in Veritate, and the fact of the matter is, how are we going to be not just relevant, but offer a humanism that will secure a true development for humanity in a global world where Catholicism has something to say? It can't be with anathemas right now, because that's just
Yeah.
not the landscape. And so, in a certain sense, it is another development. We're moving on towards a more Catholic way of approaching a very different world. So again, de Lubac and Ratzinger, to me, have been very enlightening in understanding the Second Vatican Council, its import, its importance, and really, it's a propedeutic. It really is a propedeutic,
It really
and
is.
it's a springboard. It really is. Yeah.
And encountering that global world, what we cannot do is what so many of the church still continue want to do, is to simply embrace it and say, well, let's baptize this.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
That
the opposite extreme. Yeah.
that God's grace is everywhere, and we just need to stand in solidarity with these very positive movements towards the unity of, so you get like elements in Fratelli Tutti in the Pope's encyclical that kind of read like the second half of Gaudium et Spes. God bless Pope
Mhm.
Francis and everything. I'm not like those who say, oh, he's a heretic. No, but
Yeah.
still, there's an element of that here, and I think this is
Hmm.
this is what irritates me the most about this papacy. It's not heresy. It's not this. It's not that. It's that there seems to be a return to a less critical appropriation of the world. Let's put it that way. A less
Yeah.
critical.
Yeah. My take currently is that if you look at the history of the papacy, especially, because we've talked about the kind of neo-scholastic hegemony before the council, papacies can have aspects that I think are, unhelpfully oppressive, right? Where authority is understood in terms of mere power and getting things done according to how we want it to be done, right? So papacies can be criticized, constructively, in charity and all that kind of stuff. Um, at the same time, I've reading these guys, Ratzinger, de Lubac, Balthasar, Guardini, has helped me make sense of the papacy of Pope Francis while not preventing me from being critical as well. So I like to think I
Yeah,
have a balanced view. I like to think that, I don't go around, you know, uh, encouraging dissent, right? I don't
right.
think that's good. I do feel that practically speaking, I am not happy with certain things, but that's happened before. So I am not someone who stays up at night. I read what the church puts out. Sometimes I like things a lot. Sometimes I think things are not very good. But never do I think the church has committed some kind of grandiose heresy or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Reading these guys has helped me make sense of the church today in a way that is much better for one's sanity than if you're on the internet watching YouTube videos by trad spokesman. Anyway.
Well, that's true, and that's I get it from both the right and the left. The
Hmm.
left wingers think I hate Pope Francis. I don't. The right
Yeah.
wingers think that I'm not hard enough on Pope Francis. And once
Yeah.
again, these are very hackneyed categories, left, right. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But the
Hmm.
fact is that, let's put it this way: there are people who think I'm too hard on Francis, and there are people who think I'm too soft on Francis. And I
Yeah.
tried to chart a middle course based on the theology that I understand and know. Ratzinger, de Lubac, Guardini, Balthasar,
Yeah. Yeah.
to a certain extent, even Congar and people like that. And
Yeah.
so I look at that and say, okay, we need to dialogue with the world, appropriate what's good from the world. We need to move out into the world, engage the world, suffer through the evils of the world vicariously in our soul, like Christ did, and yet
Hmm.
also, you know, be as be wise about it. Don't be naive. To be critical of the world as well, and that's so. I'm not on the trad camp of world
Hmm.
rejection, and I'm not in the Bishop Cardinal McElroy camp of, well, let's just embrace the rainbow alphabet and move forward. I just I
Yeah.
I just don't think that that's a critical enough appraisal of what's really going on.
I think a good example is Bishop Robert Barron. I mean,
Yeah,
from the very beginning, I've been a fan of his work, and to me, he represents the best response in America of the missionary zeal of the council, and leading with beauty. He takes in these theologians, and a big Aquinas guy. I think that's a must for someone who wants to be a serious Catholic theologian. I think Bishop Barron shows that kind of the capacity to reconcile, even though he angers the trads and mostly, but he has that capacity to take in the council alongside Aquinas which I think is very reconciliatory. And he has that missionary zeal that the council sought, right? That Pope St. John the
Yes.
23rd really wanted. And so to me, he's doing exactly what the council asked for, and he's a very good example of it. So
Oh, absolutely. And people know, who follow my blog, know, I mean, he's a friend of mine. I greatly admire him. I've known him for 20, 30 years. Great guy. And I agree with you. But notice, I mean, he's attacked by the traditionalists, and
hmm
he's attacked by the more
progressive.
left
Yep.
wing
Yep.
progressive camp of
hmm
things because he doesn't fit into any of their neat little political
That's right.
categories.
Yep.
And yet he is the bringing together. He loves Thomas Aquinas. I mean, he
Yes.
began with
Yes.
Aquinas and then moved into Newman, Balthasar,
Yes. Yeah.
and then the Resource Moscow. So he brings them together, and he is, and this he doesn't get enough credit for this. Bishop Robert Barron is an absolutely brilliant theological scholar, and he does not get enough credit for that because
That's
he's
so,
moved
yeah.
into a more popular venue. People don't read his scholarly books like The Priority of Christ and things like that.
Yes.
Really brilliant scholar.
I just read his commentary on Second Samuel and another book on the Eucharist he wrote, and I'm like, everyone knows Bishop Barron from YouTube, but my goodness, he's a real scholar. People need to start reading this guy. And Matthew Levering came out
Yeah,
with that book on his theology. I
the
just
theology
ordered it.
of Robert Barron,
Yes, yeah,
and I had some people criticize that, friends of mine say, "Oh my God, this is kind of unseemly that Robert
mm,
Barron would have his own publishing house publish a book on his theology. How narcissistic?" No, not at
yeah,
all. The fact of
mm,
the matter is this: all right, that his theology is not known, and what is known is misunderstood, and so there is actually a great need precisely for the effectiveness of Word on Fire and what Robert Barron is trying to do. There's a great need for this book by Matt Levering that I would recommend, The Theology of Robert Barron, in order to dispel a lot of the nonsense that is out there right
yes,
now. Oh,
and
Bob Barron believes that everybody goes to heaven, or
yeah,
Robert Barron doesn't care about social justice. But look, I mean,
yeah,
look at him. For example, he interviews the Jewish guy Ben Shapiro, and then the
yeah,
traditionalists hate him for that interview
yeah,
because they
yeah,
they misconstrue what he said to Ben Shapiro in that. Where in that interview, Barron says Christ is the privileged way to salvation, and they jump on that. And
hmm
yet, look, Shapiro asked him, "Hey, am I basically screwed because I'm a Jew? Am I going to go to hell?" And
yeah,
Barron said, "No, no, no, no. I mean, and when Barron says that Christ is a privileged way, all he means is explicit water baptism and explicit membership in the Catholic Church is the
hmm
privileged path to salvation, but not the only path." But he immediately states that all salvation comes from
comes through
Christ.
Christ. Yeah,
All salvation comes. But the trads, Barron says Christ is just the privileged way. But this
yeah,
is why that book on his theology, I think, was so necessary in order to
yes.
dispel some. But anyway, gosh, now I'm on a pro Robert
No, I mean,
rant.
presenting one's theological vision or the fruit of one's prayer and study is precisely a service to the church. It's not some kind of,
Yeah,
hey, look at me, I'm so smart. It's precisely that's what Pope Benedict did. His theology, he understood it as a service to the church. So, I think that's
yeah.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the entirety of that Ben Shapiro interview, the whole last half of it, Robert Barron was talking to Ben Shapiro about how Jesus is the fulfillment of Judaism, how
Yeah.
Jesus fulfills the prophecy, monarch, the prophets, the king, the priestly elements of Judah, the temple, and so on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he was evangelizing Ben Shapiro. Shapiro, his view of Jesus is that Jesus was most likely a zealot, a
hmm
revolutionary who wanted to lead a rebellion against Rome and got himself killed, and then his followers come along and create essentially this resurrection cult around this
Yeah.
revolutionary who got killed. N.T. Wright, this is where N.T. Wright is good, right? He
Yes.
he
Yes.
really
Yes.
puts the death knell to any of that
Yeah.
silliness. So in other words,
Yeah.
Barron's looking at Shapiro and saying, okay, this is his view of Jesus. I need to evangelize him by disabusing him of that view of Jesus. Not
hmm
saying, hey, by the way, Ben, if you don't come to Jesus, you're going to go to hell. That
Yeah.
wouldn't have worked. But anyway, go ahead and then we can wrap this up.
No, I mean, yeah, about Jesus, the historical Jesus. I mean, this is an area where Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI shines, of course. His
Yeah.
theology is profoundly biblical. He begins and ends with the New Testament. Everything goes back to the Jesus of the New Testament. And of course, for Ratzinger, the Christ of faith is the historical Jesus, and his series, Jesus of Nazareth, is a must read. But one thing I've discovered about that series, and I think this is a good place to end about Pope Benedict, is that that series is the tip of an iceberg. When I picked it up for the first time, I hadn't read any Ratzinger, and I only read like a couple chapters from the first volume, and I told myself, that was nice, kind of, what's the big deal? And I've returned to it after having read Introduction to Christianity, Eschatology, Principles of Catholic Theology, and the second time I read it, it was a bombshell. It was like four-dimensional. It's the tip of an iceberg, and this is where he shines. He understands modern scholarship, and he critiques it from within in a brilliant way, and presents us with the true face of Jesus Christ in that series. It's really incredible. So that would be what I recommend people to read, would be Jesus of Nazareth series. But just understand, it's the tip of an iceberg. There's a lot underneath the surface there.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Oh my goodness. I couldn't agree more. Those volumes on Jesus of Nazareth that he wrote while Pope, just amazing. And
Mhm.
especially great time during Lent here as we're heading up to Holy Week to read those things.
Yes.
Hey Dom, you know what? This has just been nothing short of fantastic. I
Thank
can't
you so
thank you.
much for having me on. I also want to say, Larry, I've been watching and reading your stuff from the beginning, so I'm a huge fan. I really appreciate your output.
Well, I know you have because
Yeah.
yeah, you had me on your show a couple years ago or whatever it
Yeah.
was. So I figured, well, the guy's following my blog at least a little bit.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate that very much. So we've got a mutual admiration society going on here. But no, I thank you so much for coming on today, and
Thank you.
maybe you'll come on again, and we can do this on a more regular basis, and
Sounds
maybe
good.
me on your show or whatever. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Hey, thanks
Definitely.
everyone for listening to it, and thanks to Dom Dalmasso. And if you want to get more of Dom Dalmasso, go to what's the web page they can go to for the Logos Project?
Yes, the Logos Project on YouTube. The I have articles on theecclesiablog.com.
That's right, theecclesiablog.com. All right. Very good, Dom. Thank you so much. And thank everybody listening.
Thank you.